The Drowned House. 5 friends left London on a grey Friday afternoon, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and the light never quite settles. The motorway stretched ahead of them like a long grey ribbon, wet from earlier rain. Inside the car, the heater hummed, but the air still felt thin and cold. Conversation came in short bursts and then died away again. As if the weather itself discouraged speech, Oliver sat in the back with his old camera resting on his knees. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then his answers came short and careful. He preferred to watch the world through the viewfinder, capturing moments other people missed, the way light fell across a stranger's face, the brief expression that passed before a smile returned. Charlotte drove with both hands firm on the wheel, her jaw set in that familiar line that meant she was already in charge of the weekend and would tolerate no nonsense. Beside her, James kept shifting in his seat, cracking his knuckles and tapping the dashboard in irregular rhythms, restless energy leaking out of him in small, nervous movements. Emily, the youngest, sat between Oliver and the door, humming under her breath and insisting that the house would be fine. Really, once we air it out and open a few windows. Thomas, Oliver's elder brother, occupied the front passenger seat. He had inherited the place 2 months earlier after a solicitor's letter arrived without warning, and he still looked as if he wished the letter had never found him. The house stood alone on the edge of the Norfolk marshes. No trees softened its outline. No garden offered any welcome. Just a tall, narrow building of dark brick and slate, rising from wet ground that stretched away in every direction under a flat, colorless sky. The marshes breathed around it, reed beds whispering against one another, black water glinting in the ditches, the occasional cry of a bird that sounded almost human and far too close. The place had belonged to their great-uncle, a man whose name was rarely spoken in the family and whose photograph had never been allowed to hang on any wall. Thomas carried the heavy iron keys in his coat pocket. He told the others they would stay one night only, clear the worst of the rubbish and the damp furniture, and put the house on the market before the season turned fully wet and the tracks became impassable. They arrived just as the last light was dying. The track that led from the road was half swallowed by mud, and the tires spun once before, finding purchase. When the car engines finally cut out, the silence that followed felt heavier than ordinary quiet. It pressed against the ears and made every small sound, the click of a door, the scrape of a boot, seem unnaturally loud. Inside, the air carried the smell of damp plaster, old paper, and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. Wallpaper peeled in long curling tongues from the walls. A grandfather clock in the hall had stopped years earlier, its hands frozen permanently at 3:20. The electricity still worked. Someone somewhere must have continued to pay the bills, but the bulbs flickered with a nervous, irregular pulse as if the current itself were uncertain of its purpose. Dust lay thick on every surface, soft and gray. In the study, behind a heavy oak door that stuck stubbornly in its swollen frame, they found a locked wooden chest bound with iron bands. James forced the lock with a screwdriver taken from the kitchen drawer. Inside, nestled carefully in yellowed linen, lay a thick black book bound in something that looked uncomfortably like cured human skin. The pages were dense with marks that were neither proper letters nor drawings, only restless, angular shapes that seemed to shift slightly whenever the eye moved away from them. Emily laughed, a bright sound that felt wrong in the close, dusty room, and said it was probably some Victorian theatrical prop left behind for atmosphere. Thomas told them, quietly but with unexpected firmness, not to touch it. That night the wind rose from the marshes. It came in long, low moans that found every crack in the window frames and set the loose panes rattling. Somewhere out in the dark, water moved against reed stems with a soft, continuous hush that never quite stopped. And beneath that sound, almost too quiet to be certain of, something whispered, syllables that never quite formed into words. Emily was the first to rise. She had slept lightly, woken by a thin singing that seemed to come from downstairs. A soft, childish tune with no words, the kind of melody a lonely child might invent while playing alone in an empty room. She followed it in bare feet, the floorboards cold and slightly sticky under her soles. The study door stood wide open. The book lay on the desk in a pool of weak moonlight, open at a page no one remembered turning. The marks on that particular page looked almost like writing now, as if they had slowly rearranged themselves while the rest of the house slept. She read the strange shapes aloud, more out of curiosity than any real belief that they meant anything. The lights went out all at once, when the others came searching for her. With the thin beams of phone torches and a single candle taken from the kitchen, they found Emily standing perfectly still in the hallway. Her eyes were wrong, too wide, the pupils swallowed entirely by a black that reflected no light at all. She smiled with a mouth that no longer quite belonged to her and spoke in a voice that was both hers and something else entirely, a voice that seemed to come from deeper in the house. He's already inside. James reached carefully for her arm. Where the drops landed, the wood seemed to drink them in with a quiet, almost eager sound. For a moment, the entire house itself appeared to breathe, a long, slow inhalation that made the walls shift fractionally inward and the floor tilt under their feet. They managed with difficulty to force her down the stone steps into the cellar and lock the heavy iron-bound door. Charlotte bandaged James's hand with strips torn from a clean sheet while Oliver filmed everything with shaking fingers, the camera light cutting harsh white circles through the thickening dark. Thomas kept saying they ought to leave at once, that none of this was natural. But when they tried the cars, the engines only clicked once and died. Outside, marsh fog had risen in a solid, impenetrable wall, thick as milk and cold as river water, swallowing the track and the road beyond completely. The world had reduced itself to the house and the narrow circle of wet black ground immediately around its walls. Hours passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the wind. From the cellar came the sound of scratching, slow and deliberate at first, then more frantic, as if nails were being dragged repeatedly across stone, then laughter, high and wet and utterly without humor, then a soft, continuous tearing, as if something were being pulled carefully apart with patient hands. When they finally gathered the courage to open the door, Emily was gone. In her place crouched a figure that still wore her clothes and most of her skin, but the shape beneath had changed beyond recognition. Limbs bent at angles that bone should never allow. The face had stretched into a smile that split the cheeks almost to the ears. It moved with a liquid wrong grace, bones cracking loudly and wetly as it hauled itself up the stone steps toward them, still humming that same soft tune. Charlotte seized the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and struck with all her strength. The thing that had been Emily only smiled wider, the smile now a grotesque crescent, and drove its long fingers deep into Charlotte's shoulder. The flesh parted with a sound like wet cloth tearing. James dragged her free with a desperate shout. Blood soaked into the old carpet in a spreading dark bloom that seemed to pulse for a moment before settling. They fled upstairs, half carrying Charlotte, and barricaded themselves in the largest bedroom, dragging a heavy wardrobe and a chest of drawers against the door. Below them, the house began to change in earnest. The walls pulsed as if something large and living were breathing behind the plaster. Floorboards split with sharp successive reports. Shadows slid across surfaces that held no light source capable of casting them. The temperature dropped until their breath misted thickly and the air in the candle flame leaned sideways. Without any draft, Oliver was the next to turn. He had been filming the barricaded door, documenting every creak and shift of the wood. Suddenly, he stopped speaking mid-sentence. He turned the camera slowly toward his own face, the lens reflecting the small candle flame, and said in a calm, almost conversational voice that carried no fear at all, "We never left. We were always here." Thomas raised the old double-barreled shotgun he had found earlier in a cupboard under the stairs and fired. The blast filled the room with acrid smoke and the sharp, powdery smell of spent cartridges. The body that had been Oliver jerked violently and kept twitching on the floorboards until James took the axe from the kindling box beside the hearth and finished the work with two heavy, reluctant strokes that left the room smelling of iron and something sweeter. Only 3 remained. Charlotte's wound had begun to darken rapidly, the flesh around the puncture marks turning the color of old bruises, and then deeper still, almost black, the darkness spreading in thin branching lines under the skin. She started to hum the same childish tune Emily had followed downstairs. The melody threaded through the room like a thin, insistent wire that would not be ignored. James held her tightly as she shook, her body alternating between rigid stillness and sudden violent spasms. For a single clear second, her eyes returned to their normal color, and she looked at him with pure, desperate terror. "Don't let it take my face," she whispered. "Please." Then the moment passed like a light going out, and she lunged, teeth bared, fingers hooked into rigid claws. James did what was necessary. The sound of it stayed with him longer than the sight, and longer than he wished to remember. He and Thomas climbed the narrow attic stairs in silence and forced open the stiff hatch to the roof. Outside, the house was sinking steadily into the marsh. The dark brick walls groaned and cracked as they settled deeper into the soft ground. Black water now lapped at the lower windowsills. The fog rose higher still, and inside its shifting mass tall, thin shapes moved with slow, patient purpose. Shapes that had no clear outline, yet somehow suggested elongated limbs, jointless necks, and heads held at attentive, listening angles. Thomas looked at James across the sloping, rain-slick slate. Fine, cold rain had begun to fall, beating on their coats. His voice was almost lost in the rising wind. "One of us has to finish the book. It's the only way this ends." James understood at once. The thing that lived in the house, or that the house had become, wanted the reading completed. Someone had to go back down into the dark, find the study again, and close whatever doorway had been opened with those first spoken words. He did not speak. He simply nodded once, met Thomas's eyes for a long moment, and climbed back through the hatch into the screaming dark below. Thomas waited on the roof for as long as he could bear. Rain soaked through his coat. The house continued its slow descent. Eventually he heard, faint but unmistakable, the distant sound of pages being torn. Slow, deliberate rips, one after another, followed by a silence so complete and sudden that it felt like the end of hearing itself. When the sun finally rose over the Norfolk marshes the next morning, pale and without warmth, the house was gone. In its place lay a wide, perfectly still pool of black water that reflected the washed-out sky without a single ripple. Reeds grew thick and unbroken around its edges. No brick remained above the surface. No slate, no fragment of glass or timber. No sign that any building had ever stood on that spot. And on the wind that moved softly across the water, very faintly, almost too soft to be certain it was real, someone was still singing that same soft, childish tune.